Good. Okay. Awesome. I can hear you and welcome. Thank you for doing this. I am,
Thanks for having me.
yeah, my pleasure. I'm intrigued. Your sort of, I guess, title, I guess, or one of the things you talk about is being a blood sugar specialist, I suppose, as if that's a fair
Mhm.
term. If you can be kind enough to just kind of give us a little background history on you and tell us what brought you to be, how you became a blood sugar specialist and what do you do specifically. I think it's fairly obvious, but we'll delve into that a little more if we can.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So my story starts kind of like many of us. We grew up eating the standard American diet, eating a ton of carbs. My mom was really into that low fat thing, and I ate pretty much mostly processed breakfast foods for a lot of my youth, and I was really picky. Uh, I would go to barbecues and just eat a bun with ketchup. And it's funny because now I would eat just the burger and not the bun or ketchup. And I got really sick when I was young. I was just always had something like eczema or ear infections, tons of rounds of antibiotics. As I got older, I went to college and I started to develop really bad seasonal allergies. I started to get asthma out of nowhere. And I was like, what the heck is going on? I thought, like, I didn't think that I would be so sick at this age. So then I moved down to Miami where I developed even more allergies, and the allergy season was year round. I was even allergic to palm trees, which was like a cruel joke. And so I started to get all these allergy shots. I was struggling with getting chronic sinus infections, and I just felt like I had a terrible immune system. I just wasn't well all the time. And I was at that point where I had such fatigue that I would like drop something and start crying because my stress bucket was just so filled up and I couldn't handle it. So back in 2012, I read Rob Wolf's book and I started doing paleo, and it completely transformed my life. I got rid of my very horrible seasonal allergies, my asthma, my sinuses. Everything sort of fell into place. But then on paleo, I kind of took my old sugar addiction habits and just transformed them to paleo food. So it was lots of sweet potatoes and plantain chips and kombucha and paleo treats and coconut sugar and all that. And so while I did improve a lot, all of a sudden I started to have a lot of hormonal issues. And I didn't know at the time that all these carbs and sugar were at the root of it. So I developed PCOS, and I was trying so hard to balance my sex hormones and to start to improve those symptoms, but just could not make a dent no matter what I did. So finally, I heard a podcast from Dr. Jason Fung and Megan Ramos, and she said that PCOS is the diabetes of the ovaries. And I nearly crashed my car. I was like, what? What do you mean diabetes? Is that, I know that has something to do with blood sugar, but I had no idea I had blood sugar issues. So I really started to delve into this. I went to nutritional therapy school and became a nutritional therapy practitioner. And now I specialize in blood sugar regulation because this was this hidden issue that was at the root of so many of my chronic health issues. And I didn't even know it. And so all I knew about diabetes was something about sugar and something about amputations. That's literally all I knew. And so many people are plagued with this. And I myself had reactive hypoglycemia and I didn't even know it. I would drink coffee in the morning and start shaking. I thought it was from too much caffeine. I finally got a blood sugar meter. My blood sugar was 66, and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to eat something. It started to make sense why I was that person who needed to eat before I went out to eat, why I was that person who always had to carry like a granola bar in my purse. I was always thinking about food. And it wasn't because I was so obsessed with food. I just knew that I had a really low tolerance for hunger because my blood sugar was crashing and I had no ability to tap into stored body fat for fuel. So that was really what was going on with me. And so now I'm really passionate about helping people uncover these earlier signs of blood sugar dysregulation and help to reverse insulin resistance, improve blood sugar so that people can get rid of those diagnoses, prevent themselves from even getting there in the first place, and just feel so much better because blood sugar affects how we feel in the short term and in the long run. So it's something that, as I'm sure your community is well aware, that it just really affects us in so many ways.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of things we could talk about. I see some questions coming in. One of the things, most people, when we talk about blood sugar, endocrinologists, diabetes nurse educators, registered dietitians, other nurse, nutritional therapists, all sort of touch on this realm. I mean, as an orthopedic surgeon, blood sugar regulation wasn't really my purview, but I subsequently learned just tremendously about it. And it does actually affect so many different things. But, um, and it's not just diabetics, by the way. I mean, it's, it affects us, non-diabetics as well. And I think there's, perhaps we don't cast a wide enough net when we talk about diabetic pathophysiology. If you look at the work I think it was Richard Kraft, back, it was Richard or Robert Kraft, I think it was Robert Kraft, 1970s, basically saying there are just what we see from on the diagnosed diabetics is kind of the tip of the iceberg, and underneath that there's this mountain of people that are pre-diabetic or hyperinsulinemic and don't have blood sugar dysregulation yet. And so let's talk about why do we care about blood sugar, just in general, because I mean many of us know, but there may be people that don't really understand the relationship between blood sugar and disease, and that's both hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia actually has a role there too. So talk about those things if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So blood sugar is something that's going to affect so many, it affects every single cell in our body. So it's going to have these widespread effects that could seem unrelated. So normally we are supposed to get sugar into our cells to fuel our body. We can use fats, ketones, different things to fuel ourselves. But the problem comes when we are unable to really tap into those stored body fats for fuel, or utilize other types of macronutrients to fuel our body. And so we'll start to get perhaps shaky or lightheaded or dizzy. We might feel irritable or anxious. We have difficulty concentrating or have brain fog. You might feel tired or weak or lethargic. You might get nauseous. You may have sweats or heart palpitations. You might feel like hangry instead of just hungry, that your hunger feels really intense and urgent. And you might have sugar, carb, and starch cravings. And these are all early signs of having low blood sugar. And conversely, when we have high blood sugar, we might still have some of those same symptoms. So either high or low blood sugar is really stressful for the body, and the body does not like to have it out of this nice Goldilocks range. And so in the short term, you might experience some of those symptoms that I just mentioned. And some people actually don't actually feel those symptoms because they have sort of developed these behaviors to prevent themselves from ever feeling this way. And so that was what I talked about before, how I always had like a granola bar in my purse, or I ate before I went out to eat in case the server took too long bringing the food or something like that. So these behaviors that you might have if you don't have any of those symptoms are that you might have to eat every few hours, you might be snacking or grazing all day just to sustain your energy, or depending on stimulants like caffeine. You might be someone who just gravitates towards carbs or sweets or starches, and then you might just feel like you're a person who needs carbs or sugar to function. So those are really common issues. And then we start to see these longer term effects take place where you're having weight loss resistance, you're having energy crashes before or after eating, fasting is like completely impossible for you, mood swings, slow metabolism, and then this cascade of effects turn into things like fatty liver, prediabetes or diabetes, anxiety, infertility, PCOS, high blood sugar, high cholesterol. So it's having these high levels of insulin in our blood all the time, paired with having so much sugar in our blood or not enough, that is extremely stressful or causing things to be like overgrowing. So that insulin's this anabolic hormone. So there's so much growth, like people with high insulin levels are getting really thick arteries, for example, because it's just continually perpetuating this growth in the body. And then insulin is a hormone, so it affects all other hormones. So you're going to see a lot of hormonal imbalances and things like that. So this can happen if your blood sugar is too high or too low, because that is oftentimes when it's too low, it's because it was too high at first and then there was too much insulin, so then it went low, or even just your body not being able to maintain a normal blood sugar level due to some adrenal fatigue or things like that.
I want, just to clarify more, there's people that talk about they have reactive hypoglycemia, or they get low and have not been diagnosed as diabetic. My thought around that is that probably is early evidence of diabetic pathophysiology. It's probably just a dysregulated, insulin in that situation. What are your thoughts around the people that talk about it? Does that predict later development of diabetes for many people?
So for many people, it is this underlying insulin resistance. And I see that quite often. Oftentimes people who have even prediabetes will feel symptoms of reactive hypoglycemia if their blood sugar is in the 90s, 100s, 110s. So you can start to feel the blood sugar going down. And I think that it is this severe lack of metabolic flexibility that the body is like sending out all these alert signals, because you are just like, you are about to tap out of your energy stores and you have no other backup option. And so, yeah, I do put this on this spectrum of diabetes. Like I made a graphic, but underneath the whole, it starts with like blood sugar dysregulation, then perhaps reactive hypoglycemia, prediabetes, diabetes, but underneath the entire thing is just worsening insulin resistance. And so I do think that it's mostly insulin resistance happening. And then the other thing I see it with is sometimes food sensitivities can exacerbate or worsen the reactive hypos.
You talked about a Goldilocks zone for blood glucose. If you listen to, I think, standard medicine, I think it's 70 to 140 or something like that. That's typically what people want to keep the glucose in. If you're diabetic, for whatever reason, the endocrinologist put the number a lot higher because they're scared of the hypoglycemias, and I think that's a disservice to their patients, quite honestly. But
Yeah.
What do you say about there's people that have very stable blood glucose? It might be 100, 102, 105. Is that worse than a situation where you have very, very labile blood sugar? I mean, what's the what are we trying to achieve here? What is the goal? Do we know?
So I think that, there's a lot of bioindividuality at play when it comes to blood sugar, but I think that a more stable blood sugar, so if it hovered around the hundreds all day, as opposed to these swings, is much less stressful for the body. And that is, I see that with a lot of clients. People come to me, they don't really have that many issues. If they're sort of just hovering along that straight line, some of them can. I do think that that range up to 140, it might be less stressful for the body if it's under 140, but ideally, if we're looking towards optimization, I know myself and many of my clients, we don't feel good if it's above really like 110 on the regular. And so getting those blood sugar numbers down. And then there's also that caveat of, people might wake up and their blood sugar is 72 and they're shaky and they're like, oh, my blood sugar is 72. So it's in a good range, but they're experiencing those reactive hypoglycemia symptoms. Or just hypoglycemia symptoms. So making sure that when your numbers are that low, that you feel good at those numbers. So it's not enough to just be at that number and feel like you're going to pass out. That wouldn't be as good. But yeah, the swings are really what's causing a lot of issues, because that's giving us a lot of insulin output. And then we know that the drops are because of too much sugar getting put away into the body. So absolutely stable blood sugar is much more, it'll feel much better in your body than the highs and lows.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you bring up about the symptomatic nature of actually hypoglycemia, because some people like to put a number on that. And I say it's really a symptomatic thing, because we have people, I myself was sat there with a blood glucose of 50, and I'm done podcasts and worked out, and I had no problem at all.
Yeah.
And yet there are other people that, if they were down in 50s, they would be close to seizing, and so it's particularly people that are used to running very high. And so I think we have to put that as a relative number. Cahill in I think it was maybe 1970s, 60s, did experiments where he brought people's blood glucose down into the teens and 20s, and they were conversant, having conversations. What he did was he put them on prolonged fasting and the significant ketosis, and then he administered an insulin on top of that, and he brought them down into the 20s, and they were completely fine. Now, a normal person, particularly a person that's eating, sort of habituated eating a lot of carbohydrate, you brought their net blood glucose down to 20, you might kill them. So, I mean, it's one of those things you just have to kind of understand it relatively, what's going on there. I know you probably are familiar with Richard Bernstein, I would imagine. I don't know if you are or not, but
No, I'm not.
so he's a doctor that I think he's 85 or so years old, and
Oh, Dr. Bernstein, with the
Dr.
type 1
Bernstein.
diabetics?
Yeah. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So
Yes, I
anyway,
am. Mm-hmm.
what his thought is on hypoglycemia is there are literature relationships between people experiencing frequent, and again, this is in the diabetic population, experiencing frequent lows, and things like dementia, and issues with that. But the caveat to that is it's usually in response to a over treatment of insulin and a wild swing. So we have these wild fluctuations, ups and downs. So they're having as many highs as lows. It may just be the highs they're always having. Whereas if you have people that are steadily sitting in the 60s, 50s, and are not fluctuating, is probably not an issue. That's at least his take on it, and I tend to concur with that. But
yeah, the law of small numbers, where you have to
minor swings and minor fluctuations. Therefore, you need less insulin to treat that. That's interesting. Let me ask you about, because this is sort of a controversial topic. I see people that we're in a carnivore community. Most people are eating basically not really any negligible carbs. Some still do, but most of them don't. And there's a sort of a relationship between fat and protein. And it seems like the more protein you eat, there's a tendency for a higher blood glucose. I think all three macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbs, and I don't really count alcohol, but alcohol has an effect as well, but will have some impact on blood glucose, whether it's direct, indirect, later, acute or chronic. But we see that people that kind of skew to a higher fat diet generally have better blood glucose control. Sometimes I see, like, I'll use myself for example. If I eat more protein, I get leaner, my body composition is better, but my blood glucose is higher than if I were to eat a higher fat approach. And so the question is, am I doing better by having more body fat, or am I doing worse? And is there a trade-off, and what's the trade-off, and where do we do that? Do you run into that situation at all?
Yeah, I do run into that situation a lot. And that's why I personally have not had much success doing just carnivore. I'm heavily meat-based, but if I just do plain carnivore for more than about a week, then the gluconeogenesis starts to raise my blood sugar, and I personally don't feel as well. I start to get cravings. I start to feel like I'm not hungry, and I start to feel like some of those hypoglycemia symptoms start to creep in, depending. I see with a lot of clients who are doing carnivore, by telling them to increase their fats, their blood sugar does stabilize a little bit. So I think that for a lot of people, it's going to be like, what is your goal? So is your goal to lean out, or is your goal to have better blood sugar numbers? And I just can't say in terms of like long term. I don't know what the effects of that would be, but I think it's going to be individual to a person if they're going to react in a negative way. Because you said that you seem to not, even though your blood sugar is higher, you don't feel worse. So I think that a lot of times it's going to be driven again by symptoms. So if you feel good, if you feel the same, then that's just maybe a mechanism of the body, and it could be fine. But I do see a lot of people struggling to keep their numbers down if they are not doing enough fat.
Yeah, and so the question, this is interesting, and maybe you know this or maybe not. I think around 1980, the definition of diabetes changed. The blood sugar definition used to be 140. Used to be a fasting blood glucose above 140, and then I think somewhere in 1980 or so they changed it to 126. Why they did that, I'm not sure. Maybe they wanted to sell more metformin, or who knows. But it could have been, and it's interesting because why that occurred. Maybe because we had this greater prevalence of population just becoming obese, and we're seeing this thing. So we're gonna change the definition. We've done something similar with blood pressure recently, where we changed the systolic blood pressure from 140 down to 130 as a definition. A lot of people push back and say, why? There's no real evidence to support that. Interestingly, if you go back to the 1920s and you look at metabolic studies on Eskimos, Inuit, at the time they were calling them Eskimos. I guess Inuit's more appropriate now, but they saw that the fat, I referenced a study from, I think it was 1920 something, 26 or something like that. And the Inuit were eating 4 to 8 pounds of meat a day, and their blood glucose was routinely running about 120s. And they didn't have any evidence of any disease whatsoever. And so the question becomes, what is the actual top end? Do we know? Is it still up in the air? I know when we're selling medication, not that I'm advocating you should have blood glucose of 300, but I mean, is there, what is a true top end? And I know, I understand, like when people's blood glucose gets high, 200, 300, they feel awful. I mean, they're tired. Some of them do. Some of them just, some of them need it that high because they're so used to that. And if it goes below 200, they feel crappy because they're like, they have this reactive hypoglycemia at 160 or something like that, which is kind of insane to think about that. It's interesting. I think it's stuff we still don't fully know. Tell me about, there are, I use, carnivore, some people are adding different carbohydrates into that. Some people are adding fruit and honey and that type of stuff. Some, I think it's kind of individualized in my view for what people do. Some people, that's a recipe for disaster. For some people, it works well. And I don't know that we know yet what's going on with that. What's your view on how do you treat diabetics differently than, and my assumption is you mostly work with diabetics. Is that correct? Or do you work
No,
with...
I actually don't.
Okay.
I mostly work with people who have blood sugar dysregulation. So they're anywhere sort of on that spectrum. Several diabetics, of course, several people pre-diabetic, helping them to reverse their diabetes and PCOS, which is the insulin resistance, but pretty much all along the spectrum.
And I think these are other things that are important. I mean, obviously food has a huge role in blood sugar. There's other things. There's exercise. There's different types of exercise. There's sleep and there's stress. And so what is, if somebody comes to you and they are like, let's say they're not diabetic, but they're, for whatever reason, they're concerned about their blood glucose and it's a little bit, kind of labile, and maybe they have reactive hypoglycemia. How do you go about assessing them and treating them?
Yeah, so I use a questionnaire that we got in nutrition school to assess. It basically is a really detailed questionnaire that gives me this awesome chart of their root causes. And we look at these specific areas, especially digestion, making sure they're eating a nutrient-dense, healthy diet that's appropriate for them, hydration, minerals, fatty acids, and blood sugar balance. So those are our foundations in terms of nutrition. And so we would look at those areas. First and foremost, digestion is the number one healing priority of the body. If you can't digest and break down your fats, if you can't break down your proteins, it's going to be extremely inflammatory to your body. And as we know, what happens in the gut doesn't stay in the gut. If we have leaky gut, or if we have this inflammation that's being carried around, like all these inflammatory molecules being carried through our bloodstream into all different areas and sort of wreaking havoc all over the body, and sort of gets us where we're most susceptible. That's where we see a lot of differences in symptomology, but it's really coming from this inflammation in the gut, lack of nutrient absorption. So we really have to take care of digestion first and foremost. Then we look at, I also have them fill out a food and mood journal. So we look at what they're eating. We use a lot of, depending on where they're at. So some people come to me and they're eating a carnivore diet or a keto diet. Some people are eating a standard American diet. So I really meet people where they're at and try to give them things to increase the nutrient density of their diet, take out things that might be inflammatory. We often pair this with food sensitivity testing, again, to get down that inflammation in the gut, support the body with different supplements that are, again, supporting these root causes, supporting the body's own natural ability to heal, and just helping the body do what it does best, because we can't play, the body very well. I mean, look at type 1 diabetics struggling to play pancreas all day. So we know that the body has this innate ability to heal. So we support that. And then we look at different potential nutritional deficiencies, because as an NTP, I don't diagnose or treat anybody, but we look at potential ones. And then we also add a lot of lifestyle things. So we look at their sleep, we look at, getting outside in the morning, getting sunlight, creating a morning and evening routine to support healthy stress levels. I tell my clients very often, your stress is not going anywhere, but you need to do your job of getting out of that sympathetic fight or flight nervous system state and forcefully putting yourself into a parasympathetic state. So I give them a lot of breathing exercises. There's essential oils that activate the vagus nerve, which helps you tap into rest and digest. This is really important before you eat, because if you're eating in a sympathetic state, your body literally will stop digestion. It stops producing saliva, stomach acid, bile. It stops moving the intestines. So getting into that state before we're eating is really important. And then, of course, throughout the day. So the breathing exercises, guided meditations, getting outside in nature, going for a walk, looking at different barriers to their success, talking about like how easy, people going out to eat all the time, looking at routines and lifestyles that they have and where, what needs to give, because you can't heal in the same environment in which you got sick. So it's a very holistic approach to looking at all those things. And then for some people, we do add in some carbs, especially for women around their cycles. I actually had a client in my group coaching, and she said she was doing carnivore for a year. She got so many benefits from it, but had all these hormonal issues with her cycle. And she added in some carb ups around ovulation and right before her cycle, and had the best like period of her life. And she was feeling so great. And so she's like, I love doing carnivore most of the time. And now, individualizing it for her, that worked really well for her, in addition to supporting her digestion. That was really helpful for her too. So,
Yeah, one of the things I've heard, with women, particularly with regard to pregnancy, because we have a lot of women that do a carnivore diet, and they've done it through pregnancy, and they've really struggled often in the first trimester for whatever reason, and they end up adding some sort of carbohydrate in. So, I mean, it's interesting to see who that affects, and maybe there's a difference between, obviously there's a difference between women and men, on many levels, despite some of the recent social stuff that's going on. But I mean, there's obviously medical differences and genetic and physiological differences. Do you find that there are things that are typically much different with the way women and men respond to diet or other lifestyle interventions?
I just see women having a tougher time. It's like I have so many clients who say, I'm working with the woman, and she says, oh, my husband lost 11 pounds already and I only lost 2. And like, it's just, we have all these extra hormones and a very delicate cycle, and we need to be extra careful. I do also see with women that it's really easy to overdo fasting. So, and this happened with me, and it also happened with carbs. So I find that now I do better with some carbs some of the time, and I dialed back on my fasting because I'm not trying to reverse my PCOS anymore. I've already done that. But I like to use these things. I like to tell my clients to use these things as a lever. So it's like, dial it up when you need to, dial it back down when you need to. And I see that men are able to just, it's kind of like, oh, whatever, anything goes. But with women, it just is, we have to be more particular about the certain time of the month. And postmenopausal women have, again, a little bit of an easier time than menstruating women. But again, they also have those usually they're coming to me with some pre-existing hormonal imbalances, which again, make it harder in terms of like balancing hormones and fat loss.
Where do you stand on protein consumption? Are you someone that is happy with the RDA protein? Are you a higher protein person? How do you do that particular macronutrient?
So with protein, I'm not someone who likes to count or tell people to count. It's just been, I don't know, I find it to be a little bit overwhelming as someone who could get a little bit too picky with counting and tracking things. So I like to have my clients, especially if they're like getting into ketosis, I think it's, maybe start with the general ratios that are recommended, but I oftentimes will tell them to increase protein, and they do much better. So once someone is in ketosis, I say increase the protein a little bit more than that, to maybe like 35% ish of macros. And I oftentimes will tell them, if you have enough fat in your diet, you'll know if you didn't eat enough protein if you're hungry before your next meal. And so I definitely like, especially women, to be getting enough protein. I'm a fan of eating animal protein at every single meal, even if you're not doing like a ketogenic or carnivore diet. So I'm very into animal-based proteins. I see so many people just wishing that they could just have smoothies all day, and no one wants to eat real food. So I'm a really big proponent of getting these smoothies out and actually chewing your food. I mean, hunter-gatherers' jaws are so wide because they're sitting there chewing all day, and that's it's really important to our development of our face and our ability to breathe properly. And, I'm definitely into, like I said, I don't have a specific number, but I'm very pro eating enough protein for your body, and very much more than those general keto macros. I think it's way too low.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of questions about specific numbers, and I'm in the same opinion. I don't know that we have exact specific numbers. There's kind of ranges I think that most people fall in, but one thing that I would say is, when you're advocating 30-35% protein, that is, roughly double, if not more than double, the standard American diet. I mean, most Americans are only getting around 15% of their calories from protein. So
Oh yeah,
some
more
studies
than
go
that.
as low as 12, and something like that. So I think we abysmally undereat protein, particularly as older folks, they really have a problem with that. But
Yeah.
somebody asked me to define a blood sugar spike. I mean, some people say it's 30 points. I mean, it's just whatever. I mean, again, these are all kind of arbitrary numbers, and
Yeah.
how much is enough fat, and can you sort of maybe comment on that? Maybe you don't have specific numbers,
Sure.
but maybe a general comment.
Yeah, so a spike, generally speaking, like you said, is like maybe when it goes up by 30, we generally want to make sure it doesn't spike over 140 again, because that is stressful for the body. But I get, if it's like it went up 29 points, it's not like, oh, phew, it only went up 29 points. It's still, we just don't want that big drastic rise in the blood sugar. So I would say that would be a spike. And then the second thing you asked me about is like how much fat. So in general, I tell my clients I tell them to okay, so this is mostly a carnivore, so it's going to be a little bit different, but I have them add like 3 to 4 fats per meal. So for some people, if we're doing keto, that might look like having a fatty piece of meat, having some avocado on the side, some olives, and like a bunch of butter on top of all of this. So we're making sure that we're prioritizing like 3 different portions or 4 different portions of like servings of fat, and then starting with that fatty animal protein. So that would be consistent for the carnivore community as well. So doing that plus, let's say, like a fatty steak with some butter, maybe you do some, pork fat or something, like, or beef fat or something on the side, and you have like a decent amount. So it's just going to be different for everybody. But I'm not into counting, and I'm more into like, here's how you make a plate, and does it make you feel full? Does it make you feel drowsy? Like, does it make you like, are you able to go to the next meal or even fast to the next day after you have that meal? Are you still craving something after you eat it? So I'm very symptom based, and coming back to asking all those questions so you can find out what works for your body, instead of just like, oh, okay, I need to have this many, like this much of this portion and this much of this portion. It's like, that might not work for you. So I can't begin to estimate what you're going to need. I want people to tune into their bodies so they know how much they need, because the other thing that we haven't talked about is that our needs are changing constantly. Like, my needs are going to be different whether I'm sick, or I'm going to get my period, or I just went to the gym really hard all week, or I'm in a really stressful situation, or it's summer or it's winter. So our needs are changing all the time. And I think that people get very stuck on doing something because it worked for them once. And this was me with paleo. I tried to just paleo harder, and that wasn't working, obviously, because that's what made me sick. So I needed to completely do something drastic. And so if you're trying something and it worked really well, and then it starts to not work again, you need to take a hard look at maybe what you're doing, maybe the scope of what you're doing. You need to open it up a little bit, because the answers might not be within the current paradigm you're using, and to be flexible and maybe not dogmatic about what your approach is, because you really might run yourself into a wall if you don't consider other options. So I like to see people sort of changing up what they're doing. It's like, oh, I was fasting a lot and now I sort of dialed it back, or I added carbs maybe in the summer, just some berries and honey, and then in the winter I don't do that anymore and I go strict carnivore. Like, I love to see people doing that because I think it's much more aligned with our, human nature.
Let me shift gears and talk a little bit about exercise. I know, like for me, I mean, when I'm interested in looking at my blood glucose, I know that like if I do some kind of light exercise, walking, moderate pedaling on a bike, my blood glucose will drop pretty reliably, assuming I do it for 15, 20 minutes or more.
Mm-hmm.
However, if I do some really high intense stuff, like some heavy deadlifts, my blood glucose may shoot up 60 to 80, 100 points.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean it's bad in that situation? Am I doing something bad by exercising hard? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because my thoughts are I'm building muscle, and that's something that humans do. And I like the way what it does for me. And so, should I be concerned about that abrupt increase in blood glucose when I exercise intensely? What are your thoughts on that?
I think absolutely not. I think it's like a hormetic stressor for the body. So the body is becoming more resilient. And I think it has these functions. Like I think that we could over CGM ourselves and be like, oh my gosh, it's going up. I went in the sauna and now my blood sugar went up, or I go in the shower, my blood sugar goes up. Should I not shower or go in the sauna or exercise because it is going up? No, it's just the physiological response of the body. It's okay. A lot of people can't tolerate it though. Like all my reactive hypoglycemics, they want to work out, but they can't do it yet because they're crashing every time. So obviously we need to do a lot of work to begin with. But if you're doing something, so you want to stress the body to where it can adapt and become stronger, not to where it's going to stress it so much that you're going to like fall over the edge. And so when your blood glucose goes up during exercise, I think it's completely fine and a completely normal thing. I never saw my blood glucose go so high as when I had just finished kayaking, and I live in Florida, and it was 1,000,000,000 degrees last summer. And I was just like putting the kayak away. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so hot. I'm so hot. And my blood sugar was like 180, and I've never seen it that high ever. And, but I was just really hot. And so it was like a stressful moment in the body. So again, it's like sometimes these low grade levels of stress over time are just going to elevate the blood sugar over time. But like you almost get hit by a car, your blood sugar spikes. It's doing that for a reason. That's that sympathetic nervous system state turning on. Same thing as when we're working out. So don't fear those spikes for the healthy things.
Yeah, that's a point I want to make. It's not so completely black and white on everything where, we talk about stable blood glucose, but there's times when you want your blood glucose to be elevated so you can perform, so you can run from a bear, or you can survive a fight or something. Like you want to have that energy. And, one of the things that, we know is our hepatic glucose output, our endogenous glucose production can go up tremendously high. I think it goes up 1,500% over baseline during intense exercise. So we have this capacity to pump out glucose when needed. And that's one of the things people talked about, well, you can't do high intensity exercise without carbohydrates. And I say, au contraire, my friend, or frère, or whatever you say, because I do it all the time. And, I've actually set world records in that situation without carbohydrates. And so it's one of those things where, I think it's just something that I think there's a lot more nuance than we think about it, whether it has to do with diabetic pathophysiology or regular human physiology around exercise. Are you familiar?
I just wanted to mention one more thing about the exercise is that when you do exercise and build muscle, you're actually increasing your insulin sensitivity, and same thing with the sauna, for example. So actually in the long run, it does have beneficial effects on your blood sugar. So we have to not look at this one isolated moment of like, oh, there must be something wrong. Meanwhile, it's actually doing something beneficial in the long run.
Yeah, I tend to defer to function, and often I kind of look at body composition as a marker for health. I know some people say, well, you can't look at somebody and they can be lean. I said, yeah, I think being lean and having a lot of lean muscle mass is a very good marker for health, and relatively low fat mass. But, it's one of those, and it's interesting you point out, sauna is another thing that people do for theoretical benefits. There's studies out there showing longevity benefits with that. Decreased cardiovascular mortality or incidence with regular sauna going, but it does raise your blood glucose. And that's something that people will see. Phil's asking about cold thermogenesis. I think cold plunges may also do the same thing. It's stressful. Does it bring down?
I think they lower it, but they both have beneficial effects on blood glucose in the long run. But I'm pretty sure they lower it. I'm not sure. I'm not
I
sure.
I think it's going to vary from person to person.
Yeah.
Maybe, most of the information I've seen has been on sauna. I think I've looked at cold, and I can't remember if it raised or lower, but I thought it might. I think it's
Yeah.
stressful.
The
But I mean,
cold creates the brown fat. Yes, that's right.
one of the things I've done with regard to exercise, I used to do a lot of this high intense training really quick first thing in the morning, and I didn't have time. I was doing a 2 minutes of just all out as hard as I possibly could, and then I would just go about my day, and that was something where that blood glucose spike would be there, but it would take a while to come down. Whereas now, when I do that, I always tend to follow it up with some sort of prolonged cool down, walking,
Yeah.
cycling, and that sort of quickly dissipates it, which I think is kind of a lesson that I learned over the years, which has been helpful for me. The other thing, Richard Bernstein talks about is diurnal variability. Are you familiar with that? I mean, time of day affecting glucose. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, some people, like I feel like Kate Shanahan was the one who said that, blood glucose, insulin sensitivity is better in the daytime. And then I have other people saying it's better at nighttime. So generally, I find that the rule of more like Sachin Panda's recommendations to eat during the daylight hours are, our insulin sensitivity is much better. So when people are doing all this fasting during the day and eating a ton right before sleep, I think that's going to be really abysmal for your sleep and not the best habit to get into. The other thing would be that in the morning, sometimes we have that cortisol response in the morning. So we do have this tendency to become a little bit more insulin resistant in the morning. But I find myself that I do better with carbs at night. So I think there could be some variability, but it's not something I know a ton about.
Yeah, one of the things that, just with you talk about eating at night, I mean, during the day, if you're paying attention to your blood glucose, there's a lot of things you can do to impact it. You can go forward,
Totally.
you can change the meal for you. But at night, I mean, you're asleep. There's really nothing you can do. I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
can actively do. So you're kind of, it is what it is at that point. And so I've seen, and like you, I've seen different thoughts on insulin sensitivity during time of the day. I think some of it shows it was kind of late afternoon. You tend to be fairly insulin sensitive, and in the morning, and there's probably a reason. We want, this sort of dawn effect or this cortisol phenomenon where we have these kind of regulatory hormones that kick on as we wake up. We
Mm-hmm.
need more glucose to wake up. It's kind of stressful event, and so insulin resistance early in the morning makes sense just because we want to have the glucose around. We want to have that access, that more
Yeah.
glucose. We don't want it to be disposed of too quickly.
Especially if we need
Potentially,
to
I think
go and like go hunt for food and, it's giving us that. And then by the time we get the food, early afternoon, like you said, maybe that's when we're most insulin sensitive because maybe that's when, we were generally eating after we killed the animal or something like that.
Yeah. Let me ask you about, just the role of different macronutrients. Obviously we know carbohydrates have a really rapid effect on glucose levels. Protein has a kind of a more moderate but lower response. And then some people think fat has no role whatsoever on glucose. And I think that there may be some data that counteracts it. Are you familiar with the Warsaw insulin dosing schedule? So it's interesting for type 1 diabetics. There's something called the Warsaw, I think it's called the Warsaw dosing schedule. And they basically have you dose for protein and fat. And I think I can't remember the numbers, but it's actually quite a bit higher than I would have thought it would have been. But, and the thought is that fat just basically prolongs, well, and we know it prolongs the absorption of carbohydrates or, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
protein. You just have this slower, longer response. So the spike may never be high, but
Mm-hmm.
it may just be, it may raise it 20 points and keep it there for a long time. Now, again, what I will say is my observation looking at this community, there's people that will, if they don't eat enough protein, typically, and this is in the carnivore setting, they don't get really any spike. But I mean, if they eat enough protein, then that spike is there, and then it may be prolonged with the fat. So what's your thought on the role of fat in the regulation of blood sugar?
So I think fat is like this low burning this log in the fire, and we need it to help to power us throughout. We need to run on fats because we can't just run on those carbohydrates because they're like the kindling, they just burn out really quickly. And I love the idea of adding quite a bit of fat to help satiate you and also to help carry you through the next meal. Of course, if some people are working on body composition, though, they may not want to have as much fat because then they're not burning their own body fat if they're not, utilizing the fat that they're eating. So it's definitely a little tricky when it comes to like nitpicking those macros for different people. But I do see fat as being really helpful for making sure that the blood sugar does not elevate so much. And I think that this is a way that we can prevent a big insulin spike, which I like about fat, because I think that at the end of the day, insulin is much more of the thing that we really need to be paying attention to and looking out for, as opposed to blood sugar. So I think that we are very blood sugar centric because we can measure it. It's very easy to measure. We have all these CGMs and finger prick meters. It's really easy. But how many of us have gotten fasting insulin tests and we don't have an insulin, continuous monitor? So I think that I'm looking forward to when there is technology to really look more at insulin and what's happening, because I think that, there's people, diabetics, who have perfect blood sugar numbers, but they have this rampant diabetes because their insulin is what is the issue. And so, yeah, I think that fat can really help with both the insulin and the blood sugar aspect. So, but again, it's about finding what amount works for you. And again, that's going to change, and it's going to be based on your goals and how you feel.
The comment you made about the diabetics with good blood glucose control, but still having, I guess.
Oh, it froze a little bit. All right. Okay, everyone else is here, so maybe Sean's froze. I'll catch up on some questions. There's so many. So maybe Becky, if you want to summarize and throw some for me. Let's see, the glucose hacks. So the glucose hacks would be some apple cider vinegar before a meal. If you're very strict carnivore, you might not want to do that. Or if you have histamine issues, but that's a really good one. Going for walks after meals or exercising, even eating these higher glucose foods after a workout. Oh, there we go. You're back.
Yeah, I'm back. I don't know why internet cut off and my dog just started barking, so I apologize. I'm glad you answered some of those questions. That's
Yeah.
great. I was just going to comment about the diabetics that maybe have good glycemic control.
Yeah, not perfect blood sugar, obviously, or else they would be still.
But I mean, but
diagnosis
they're still having problems. Are those typically diabetics that are on insulin that are taking just massive amounts of insulin, you think, or what's the reason for that?
I think that, yeah, it tends to be the people on the medications who are like, we're just pushing down the sugar with no regard for the insulin. So all these insulin, drugs that are causing what seems like a better blood sugar number, but it's actually worsening the physiology behind it.
Yeah, I believe it was called the Accord study, Accord 1, I think. And I think it was about, I don't know, 7-8 years ago. And they looked at two groups of diabetics. One kind of had kind of the usual control, kind of standard advice. Their hemoglobin A1C wasn't that great. It was, maybe 7. And then this Accord study where they had really intensive management, they got it down into the 6s or something like that. But the group in the intense drug management group actually had more heart attacks. Yep. So it was kind of an interesting thing that, maybe it's not just about blood glucose when it comes to diabetes, although, there's, it's very, like I said, I think there's a lot more that we don't know about it. That's interesting. I heard about the comment about the apple cider vinegar. I know some people talk about cinnamon. Some people talk, I think the walking is a good advice. Some people use things like alpha lipoic acid, and there's all kinds of, I think there's a new product on the line. Some of the biooptimizers guys have something that's just a combination of about 6 or 7 herbs, and and that's may be helpful. Who knows? I think this is the one thing, berberine. This is the one thing that I think I had a guest on, Siobhan Huggins, who talked to me, and I think she had a profound statement. We know that sort of alcohol can blunt glucose response, right? So, I mean, a lot of people, alcohol, for many people, drinking quite a bit of alcohol will drop their blood glucose. Is that a good thing? Like I'm saying, what are you measuring here? Because it may improve your blood glucose, but are you damaging your liver to do that? And
Right.
some of these herbs and compounds, berberine and metformin, they have a negative effect, perhaps. They shut down endogenous glucose production. This is what they're one of the mechanisms of action. But you're seeing a better blood glucose, but are you in turn killing mitochondria? Are you doing other damage? And so I just sort of try to figure out where we go with, what is the outcome we're looking for. And to me, it always comes back to, how do you feel? How do you look? How do you perform?
Exactly.
And some of these numbers are almost a distraction for some people. Now, again, it's not carte blanche to say, I can have a blood glucose of 300 and just be fine with it. But I think there's more nuance than we think.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. We talked a little about exercise, time of day, a little bit about the different types of exercise intensity. What are you, how would you, I mean, and I mean, cold and stuff like that. Stress can have a big role on blood glucose. I mean, getting in a fight, or, not a fist fight, but a yelling match, that can be extremely stressful. How rapidly can we see blood glucose change in response to stress? Do you know?
So it can go up pretty immediately. So I've seen this on a CGM. I was rushing around because I was late for work back when I had an office job, and I checked my blood sugar and it was high. So it happens quite quickly because that cortisol response is liberating the glucose. But unfortunately, no, cortisol doesn't suck. You'd be saying the opposite if you if you didn't have any. We definitely need it. So that's like a very common thing that we do this is something that all humans do, or like either too much is bad, so we don't want any, or like more is good, so we want like just unlimited amounts. And it's always like with nutrition, it's always this like Goldilocks amount. So we want a good amount of cortisol, but we don't want it all the time, because then it's going to cause problems. One of the things you mentioned earlier that I wanted to comment on was that after you did that high intensity workout in the morning, your blood glucose didn't come down for a while. And so before you said that you did like a cool down, I was going to say that I would recommend, or I would love to see what happened if you did just some like breathing exercises at the end of your workout to sort of get the body out of that sympathetic state. And I think that a lot of people could really benefit from doing that as like a little hack after their workouts. It's like take that advice from yoga, like do a shavasana at the end of your workout, just lay on the floor, do some deep breathing, get out of that sympathetic state, because we are in a sympathetic state so much of the day. We are in this modern society, like we're, going through traffic, going through our job, there's bills, there's relationships, there's problems, there's a pandemic, there's politics, like there's so much stuff coming at us. We're constantly in a stress state. And so we exercise because we're like, oh, this is a beneficial stressor, but sometimes our bodies just can't handle it. It's too much stress. And so it's not going to be that stress, that hormetic stress. It's going to be just after you do a workout, or even just doing what I tell a lot of my clients to do is like rest based. Oh, sorry, I'm probably a little choppy. My internet's unstable. But doing like rest based training. So you do a high intensity thing that makes you feel better. You can even just breaking up your workouts throughout the day. So doing little bursts here and there, that's actually shown in different studies to be better for blood glucose. It's really good to get you to move around. So, every hour, if you're just like, I'm going to bust out like 2 minutes of intense workout, or just like do a bunch of deadlifts or something every so often, that's actually really, really good for your body. And then it doesn't put you through that prolonged stress. And then you could just do a little bit of breathing or something to calm your body down, get out of that. And then you might find that you do a lot better.
Yeah, I've done that where I've done, just push-ups throughout the day, and I've done, and what I find for me, one of the easiest things I do for me is I just try to avoid sedation. I mean, not sedation, sedentary behavior. I generally am standing rather than sitting. I'm usually walking rather than standing. And, I just kind of make those decisions. If I'm sitting, could I be standing? If I'm standing, could I be walking? And that's a minor thing, but as we know, most of our caloric output is not during the time we exercise. I mean,
Yeah.
exercise represents a really tiny amount of our energy output and probably our glucose disposal, quite honestly. I mean, not that it's bad, and it does, like you mentioned, intense exercise, weightlifting, building muscle over long term, it has I think a 48-hour effect on improving insulin sensitivity. And so there's great reason to do it. But I think one of the things is I just, just kind of avoid sedentary behavior. And I think that really, really makes a difference there. But I mean,
Yeah.
some of the rest, the breathing and the meditation stuff, I've never personally been much to sit down and want to do that. It's just, I'm just not that way where I can do that, but I'll go for a walk. And I think it has
Yep.
the same sort of effect, for me anyway. Interesting.
Mhm.
Well, we have burned through an hour, and that by went very, very fast. I want to
Yeah.
thank you for coming on. Can you let us know where people can find out where to get a hold of you, and any more information you'd like to share about what you do?
Sure. You can find me at Danielle Hamilton Health. I can type that in the chat, or maybe Becky can type it for me. On Instagram, very active on Instagram. I have a podcast called Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast. And so you can check me out over there, anywhere you find podcasts. My website is Danielle Hamilton Health. And yeah, that's about it. So thanks so much for having me on. Thank you all for your questions and for your attention.
Thank you very much. And you guys all have a great day. We'll see everybody back tomorrow. You guys take care. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Bye. Thank you.